Hello, lovely people, and welcome back to the Sleeping Archaeologist. Today we're diving into a topic that's about as straightforward as a medieval street plan: homosexuality during the Middle Ages. Or rather, what we would now call homosexuality, because spoiler alert, they didn't call it that. They didn't call it much of anything really, except possibly Tuesday if you were in the right monastery. Now, before we begin, I should mention that this video comes with the usual historical caveats. The sources are patchy, often written by people with very specific agendas, usually involving eternal damnation, and there's a distinct lack of first-person accounts titled "My Life as a Medieval Gay, a Memoir." Most of what we know comes from legal documents, religious texts, and the occasional scandalous trial, which is rather like trying to understand modern dating culture solely through divorce proceedings and angry Reddit posts. The Middle Ages, for those unfamiliar, spans roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, which is 1,000 years of history I'm about to condense into one video. Historians everywhere are wincing, but don't worry, I'll be sure to oversimplify everything equally. Here's the thing about medieval sexuality that might surprise you. The concepts of heterosexual and homosexual as identities didn't exist. These terms weren't coined until the 19th century, which means medieval people weren't walking around thinking, "I'm gay" or "I'm straight." They were more concerned with whether their behaviour was considered appropriate or sinful according to the church. And spoiler alert, according to the church, pretty much everything enjoyable was sinful. Intimate relations? Sinful. Thinking about such relations? Sinful. Not thinking about them, but accidentally getting aroused anyway? Believe it or not, also sinful. So buckle up, because we're about to explore a time when nobody identified as gay, everybody was potentially sinful, and the church had opinions about your bedroom activities that made your nosy neighbour look positively laid back. We'll be looking at how medieval people understood intimate relationships, what the laws said versus what actually happened, and why the historical record is frustratingly silent about women's experiences. It's going to be educational, occasionally depressing, but hopefully enlightening about how different cultures construct sexuality in radically different ways. Chapter 1: The Classical Hangover. To understand medieval attitudes towards same-sex relations, we need to briefly discuss what came before, because the Middle Ages didn't emerge from a vacuum, though given the state of medieval sanitation, a vacuum would have been quite welcome. In ancient Greece and Rome, same-sex relations were relatively common, and, in many contexts, socially acceptable. Greek men could have relationships with younger men, and this was seen as part of mentorship and education. The philosopher Plato wrote extensively about love between men, and the practice was woven into the fabric of Greek society. Young men in Athens might have older male mentors who were also their lovers, and this was considered a normal part of growing up in certain social circles. The Romans had a similarly complex attitude towards same-sex relations, with one important caveat. It was all about social hierarchy and who played which role in the relationship. Being the active, dominant partner was considered acceptable and even masculine. Being the passive partner was considered unmanly and shameful, particularly for adult male citizens. Roman masculinity was apparently very fragile and required constant validation through maintaining one's social position, which sounds exhausting, frankly. Plato, that philosophical troublemaker, even compared the acceptance of same-sex love to democracy and its repression to tyranny in his dialogue Symposium. Imagine using that argument in a medieval court. Your Honour, by criminalising my love, you're basically being a tyrant. You'd be lucky to escape with just a fine and a lengthy stay in a very unpleasant dungeon. The Romans also viewed same-sex relations, particularly between men, as a form of population control in their philosophical writings, which is quite possibly the least romantic justification for anything ever. Why do you love him? Population management, darling, very practical. Not exactly the stuff of poetry, is it? But then something happened that would change European attitudes towards sexuality for the next 1,000+ years. Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine in the 4th century. And Christianity, particularly as it developed through the medieval period, had some very specific ideas about intimate relations, namely that you shouldn't be engaging in them unless you were married, trying to conceive children, and definitely not enjoying it too much. The ideal Christian, according to many church fathers, was celibate. Even marriage was seen as a concession to human weakness. The early Christian church fathers were quite austere in their views, by which I mean they had deeply suspicious attitudes toward the human body and physical pleasure in general. St. Augustine, one of the most influential theologians in Christian history, viewed intimate desire as a consequence of original sin, and believed that even marital relations were tainted by sinful desire. The only acceptable form of physical intimacy was within marriage for the sole purpose of procreation, conducted with the minimum of pleasure possible, and probably while contemplating one's mortality. St. Jerome, another influential early Christian writer, went even further, suggesting that marriage was only marginally better than fornication, and that true Christians should aspire to virginity. He famously said that a man who loved his wife too passionately was an adulterer, meaning that even within marriage you could sin by enjoying yourself too much. What a cheerful worldview. This represented a dramatic shift from classical attitudes. The ancient world said, sure, have lovers of various genders, just maintain your social position and fulfill your civic duties. The medieval church said, actually, all physical intimacy is suspect, but will grudgingly permit it within marriage for the sole purpose of reproduction, and you should feel guilty about it regardless. What a transformation! The classical world's relatively relaxed attitudes towards same-sex relations, at least among certain social classes, gave way to a religious framework that viewed almost all physical pleasure with deep suspicion. This shift didn't happen overnight, of course. Early medieval attitudes were often less harsh than later medieval ones, and it took several centuries for the Church's sexual ethics to fully permeate European society. But by the High Middle Ages, the Church's view had become dominant. Physical intimacy was for procreation only, and anything else was sinful. Chapter 2. Medieval Categories. Now, let's talk about how medieval people actually thought about intimate relations and sexuality, because it's genuinely fascinating how different their framework was from ours. Understanding this difference is crucial to understanding medieval attitudes toward what we now call homosexuality. Medieval Europeans didn't categorize people by their attractions or desires. They didn't think in terms of gay or straight because they didn't view sexuality as an identity. It was simply a collection of acts, some permissible and most not. You weren't defined by your desires, you were judged by your actions. You weren't a person attracted to the same gender. You were someone who might commit certain sins, just as you might commit the sin of theft or the sin of eating meat on Friday. The distinction is subtle but crucial. The medieval worldview divided intimate behavior into two categories, natural and unnatural. Natural relations were between a man and a woman, within marriage, for the purpose of procreation, in the missionary position, ideally without too much enthusiasm or pleasure. Everything else was unnatural, or as they termed it, sodomy. And here's where it gets interesting, and rather more expansive than you might expect. Sodomy didn't just mean what we might assume it means today. Medieval sodomy was a remarkably broad catch-all term that encompassed any intimate act that couldn't result in conception. This included same-sex relations between men, certainly, but also intimate acts between men and women that weren't procreative, self-gratification, relations with animals, and, my personal favourite, married couples engaging in relations in the wrong position. Yes, apparently God had strong opinions about positions during marital intimacy, which seems like an extraordinary amount of divine micromanagement, frankly. The term sodomy comes from the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah, those cities that God destroyed with fire and brimstone in the book of Genesis. The medieval interpretation was that Sodom was destroyed because of various intimate sins, though biblical scholars have pointed out that the actual sins of Sodom, according to the prophet Ezekiel, included inhospitality, pride, and exploitation of the poor. But why focus on economic injustice and social inequality when you could obsess about intimate behavior instead? Much more titillating for medieval preachers. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century theologian who had opinions about absolutely everything and wrote them all down in excruciating detail, ranked intimate sins in order of severity in his massive work, Summa Theologica. In his view, the worst intimate sin was bestiality, followed by sodomy between men, then non-procreative acts between men and women, and finally fornication and adultery. So according to Thomas, same-gender intimate relations were actually worse than adultery, worse than breaking your marriage vows and betraying your spouse. This seems like a very specific and rather peculiar set of priorities, but Thomas was nothing if not thorough in his categorization of sin. The important thing to understand is that medieval people saw these acts as sins anyone could potentially commit, not as indicators of a person's fundamental nature or identity. A man who had intimate relations with another man wasn't a sodomite in the sense of a fixed identity. He was a person who had committed the sin of sodomy. The distinction might seem subtle to modern ears, but it's crucial for understanding the medieval mindset. It's the difference between I did something wrong and I am fundamentally wrong as a person. This framework meant that same-gender desire was understood as temptation, something that might afflict anyone, like the temptation to steal or to lie. The proper response was to resist the temptation through prayer, fasting, and self-discipline. If you failed and gave in to temptation, you could confess, do penance, and be forgiven. Your sin didn't define you permanently. It was something you had done, not something you were. Of course, this didn't make life any easier for people who experienced same-gender attraction. If anything, it might have been worse in some ways, because there was no framework for understanding these feelings as natural or innate. You couldn't say, this is just who I am, and that's acceptable. You could only think, I keep having these sinful desires and I must be morally weak for experiencing them. There was no community of people like you, no shared identity, no language to describe your experience except in terms of sin and temptation. The medieval framework also meant that bisexuality, as we understand it today, was completely incomprehensible. A man might have intimate relations with both men and women throughout his life, but he wouldn't think of himself as bisexual. He would simply be someone who sometimes committed sodomy and sometimes engaged in acceptable marital relations. The idea that someone might be attracted to multiple genders as a stable aspect of their identity simply didn't exist in medieval thought. Cheerful stuff, isn't it? Let's move on to the legal consequences. Chapter 3. Laws and Punishments. Right. Let's discuss everyone's favourite topic, medieval legal consequences for sodomy. And by favourite, I mean deeply sobering and historically important to understand. The laws against sodomy varied dramatically across medieval Europe, both in terms of severity and enforcement. Some regions were relatively lax, or at least inconsistently harsh, while others were absolutely draconian. It's rather like speed limits today, technically illegal everywhere, but whether you actually get punished depends on where you are, when you are, and how much the authorities care that particular day. In early medieval Europe, particularly before the 12th century, penalties for sodomy were often relatively mild by medieval standards, which is admittedly a low bar, considering medieval standards included things like being drawn and quartered for treason. We're talking fines, public penance, temporary exile, or periods of imprisonment. Not pleasant, certainly, but you got to keep your life, which was always a plus in medieval terms. However, as we move into the High and Late Middle Ages, roughly the 12th century onward, things got significantly worse. The Church began to take a much harder line on matters of intimate morality, and secular authorities followed suit. This shift was part of a broader reform movement within the Church that sought to regulate all aspects of Christian life more strictly. By the 13th century in many parts of Europe, sodomy had become a capital offence. The preferred method of execution was burning, because apparently regular execution wasn't dramatic enough. The symbolism was that fire purified sin, though I suspect the real reason was that it served as a particularly horrific deterrent to others. In 1260, France introduced burning as the standard punishment for sodomy under the legal code known as the Coutume de Beauvaisis. Spain followed suit with similar laws. The Italian city-states developed elaborate legal codes against it, with some cities establishing special courts dedicated specifically to prosecuting sodomy cases. England made it a capital crime under the Buggery Act of 1533, though that's technically just after the medieval period. Henry VIII really wanted to get in on the persecution action, possibly because he was looking for ways to assert royal authority over matters previously handled by church courts. But here's the thing about medieval law enforcement. It was sporadic at best. Unlike modern states with their police forces and surveillance systems and ability to track people's movements, medieval authorities had limited means of discovering what people were doing in private. Most sodomy prosecutions came about through denunciations, someone reporting someone else, often for personal or political reasons, or when behavior became public scandal that couldn't be ignored. There are documented cases of people being executed for sodomy throughout medieval Europe, but they're relatively rare in the historical record compared to the frequency with which such acts must have occurred. This suggests that either medieval people were extraordinarily chaste, which seems highly unlikely given human nature, or that most people simply weren't caught. The gap between law and enforcement was substantial, and many historians believe that sodomy laws were enforced selectively and often for political purposes, rather than out of genuine moral concern. Interestingly, many prosecutions for sodomy were actually politically motivated. If you wanted to destroy a political rival or enemy, accusing them of sodomy was an excellent method. The accusation alone could ruin someone's reputation, and if you had enough influence, you might even secure a conviction. The Knights Templar, that famous military order of crusading monks, were suppressed in the early 14th century, partly through accusations of sodomy and heresy. Were they actually engaging in same-gender relations? Possibly some were. Were the accusations primarily a pretext for King Philip IV of France to seize their enormous wealth and break their power? Almost certainly yes. Accusations of sodomy were also regularly used against heretics, Jews, Muslims, and basically anyone the authorities wanted to demonize. It was the ultimate smear, the medieval equivalent of accusing someone of the worst possible crime, which they also did, often simultaneously with other accusations. When you wanted to destroy someone's reputation completely, you threw every accusation you could at them. The prosecution of women for same-sex relations was even rarer than for men, which brings us neatly to our next chapter and the frustrating silence of the historical record regarding women's experiences. Chapter 4. Women. What women? Let's talk about romantic and intimate relationships between women in the Middle Ages, which is going to be a shorter conversation than it should be because the historical record is about as sparse as a medieval peasant's dinner table during a bad harvest year. The simple fact is that we have very little documentation about intimate or romantic relationships between women during the Middle Ages. There are several reasons for this, and none of them are particularly cheerful for those of us interested in recovering women's history. First, women in medieval Europe had limited literacy and almost no access to the means of literary production. Most of what was written during the Middle Ages was written by men, usually clergy, and men were apparently not very interested in documenting women's lives in general, let alone their intimate relationships with each other. Women's experiences were systematically excluded from the historical record unless they intersected with male concerns: property, inheritance, marriage, childbirth. Second, medieval society was deeply patriarchal and didn't take women's intimate lives particularly seriously unless they affected men's property rights or legitimate succession. Physical intimacy in the medieval male mind was largely defined by penetration, and specifically by a male organ. If there was no male organ involved, was it even really intimate relations? Could it even really be sodomy? This is obviously a deeply limited and male-centered view of human intimacy, but it was the prevailing one among those who wrote the laws and kept the records. Thomas Aquinas, our old friend with all the opinions, barely mentioned intimate relations between women in his extensive writings on various sins. When he did mention it, he categorized it as a lesser sin than male sodomy, because it didn't involve spilling seed, the waste of male reproductive material being a particular concern in a worldview. that saw procreation as the only justification for intimate relations. Women's intimate acts with each other were almost an afterthought in theological discussions, barely worth mentioning compared to the extensive attention paid to male sodomy. This doesn't mean romantic or intimate relationships between women didn't exist. Of course they did. Human beings have always formed emotional and physical bonds with each other in all possible combinations. It just means they weren't documented, prosecuted, or discussed with the same frequency as male same-sex relations. Women's intimate lives were largely invisible to the historical record, which is both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because they faced less legal persecution and public scrutiny, a curse because their stories have been largely lost to history, and we can barely glimpse their experiences across the centuries. There are occasional tantalizing glimpses in the historical record, brief windows into worlds we can barely imagine. Legal records from some regions mention women being prosecuted for using implements to have intimate relations with other women, which was considered sodomy because it mimicked penetrative relations. In these cases, the punishment could be severe, sometimes even capital punishment, because the use of an implement was seen as a woman attempting to usurp the male role, which violated gender hierarchies as much as moral laws. There are also records of women who lived as men, sometimes for their entire adult lives, and who married women. When discovered, these cases caused scandal and legal proceedings. Were these women transgender men in the modern sense? Were they lesbians, finding a way to live with their partners in a society that didn't recognize such relationships? Were they simply women seeking the freedoms, opportunities, and legal rights available to men? Without their own testimony, we can't know for certain, though it's likely that different individuals had different motivations and different understandings of their own identities. One of the most fascinating cases from late medieval England involves a person named Eleanor Rykener, arrested in 1395 in London. The court records reveal that Eleanor had been assigned male at birth but was working in women's clothing, serving clients of various genders. The court records are fascinating because the authorities don't quite know what to do with Eleanor or how to categorize this situation. Was this sodomy? Cross-dressing? Something else entirely? The authorities seemed as confused as modern historians are about how to interpret this case. Convents and monasteries provided spaces where women lived together in close quarters, often for their entire lives, and there are occasional hints in religious writings warning against particular friendships between nuns. These warnings suggest that romantic or intimate relationships between nuns did occur, though how frequently is impossible to say. The very existence of these warnings tells us that the behavior they were trying to prevent was common enough to be a concern. The French writer Marie de France, who lived in the 12th century, wrote lais, short narrative poems that sometimes featured intense emotional bonds between women. Were these lesbian relationships? Possibly. Or possibly just intense friendships in a culture that allowed for more emotional intimacy between women than we typically see in modern Western culture. The ambiguity is itself revealing. Medieval people had no clear language for these relationships, so we're left interpreting silences, implications, and reading between the lines of texts that may or may not have been describing romantic love. There are also records of female mystics who wrote about their love for other women in terms that seem intensely romantic and even physical, though they framed these relationships in religious terms, love for fellow nuns or spiritual sisters. Were these sublimated intimate relationships? Genuine spiritual friendships? Both? The language of religious devotion and the language of romantic love were often intertwined in medieval writing, making it difficult to distinguish one from the other. What we can say with certainty is that women who loved women existed throughout the Middle Ages, as they have in every time and place in human history. Their stories simply weren't told or weren't preserved or were deliberately obscured by those who kept the records. History has not been kind to their memory, and we're left with fragments and shadows where there should be full narratives. Chapter 5. Reality versus Rhetoric. Now, here's where things get interesting. There was often a substantial gap between what the church said about sodomy and what actually happened in practice. Medieval people were just as capable of saying one thing and doing another as modern people, which is to say extremely capable. Despite all the fire and brimstone rhetoric from pulpits, despite the harsh legal penalties on the books, same-sex relations continued throughout the Middle Ages. They happened in monasteries, in royal courts, in universities, in urban centres, and presumably in rural areas as well, though we have even less documentation from peasant life than from elite circles. Monasteries and convents are particularly interesting cases. These were single-gender institutions where people lived in close quarters, often for their entire lives from adolescence onward. The Church was well aware of the potential for same-sex relations in these settings and issued numerous warnings and regulations against it. The very frequency and repetition of these warnings suggests that the behaviour they were trying to prevent was actually quite common. You don't keep issuing the same rules over and over unless people keep breaking them. Medieval monastic rules often included provisions against monks sleeping in the same bed, being alone together in private spaces, or forming particular friendships, intense emotional bonds that might lead to something more. The 13th century Council of Paris ordered that lamps be kept burning all night in monastic dormitories so that no one could get up to anything under cover of darkness. The fact that these rules existed and had to be repeatedly reinforced tells us that monks were, in fact, getting up to things that the authorities wanted to prevent. Some monastic rules are remarkably specific about what they're trying to prevent, which gives us clues about what was actually happening. Rules against touching, against lingering looks, against sitting too close together, against exchanging gifts or love tokens. All of these suggest that monks and nuns were forming romantic attachments and finding ways to express them despite the rules. There are also documented cases of same-sex relationships in royal and noble circles, though these are often described in coded language or reported by chroniclers with particular biases. King Richard I of England, yes, Richard the Lionheart, that paragon of medieval masculinity, was reported by contemporary chroniclers to have had an intimate relationship with King Philip II of France before they had their famous falling out. The chronicler Roger of Hoveden wrote that they ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night their beds did not separate them. Now, medieval men did sometimes share beds without any intimate connotation. It was cold, beds were expensive, and privacy was a luxury. But the chronicler seems to be implying something more than mere bed sharing. Edward II of England is perhaps the most famous medieval king associated with same-sex relationships. He was widely believed by contemporaries to have had intimate relationships with male favourites, particularly Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser. These relationships were politically disastrous for Edward, not necessarily because they were with men, but because he allowed these favourites to accumulate too much power and influence which alienated the nobility. He showered them with titles, lands and privileges, which created resentment among other nobles who felt sidelined. When Edward was eventually deposed and killed in 1327, rumours spread about the manner of his death, though most historians believe these rumours were propaganda rather than truth. The rumours themselves are revealing of medieval attitudes. Even in death, Edward was being punished symbolically for his supposed intimate sins in the popular imagination. Medieval universities were also settings where same-sex activity apparently flourished. Young men living together, away from family supervision, with lots of time for intellectual pursuits and physical recreation. The Church was constantly issuing warnings about sodomy in university settings, which again suggests it was happening with some frequency. University statutes from Oxford, Paris and Bologna all include provisions against sodomy, and some university authorities conducted periodic investigations and prosecutions. Urban centres in Italy, particularly Florence and Venice, became so associated with sodomy that special courts were established to prosecute it. Florence's Office of the Night was created in 1432 specifically to investigate sodomy, and over the next 70 years it prosecuted thousands of men. Some estimates suggest that by the time a Florentine man reached 40, he had a better than even chance of having been formally accused at some point. Most received fines rather than execution, suggesting that while the authorities took it seriously, They also recognised that prosecuting everyone with maximum severity would be impractical and would implicate a huge portion of the male population. What's fascinating about the Florentine records, which survive in remarkable detail, is that they show same-sex relations were widespread across all social classes. It wasn't confined to any particular group, it was everywhere, from wealthy merchants to artisans to workers. Young men in Florence apparently participated in same-sex activities with such frequency that it was almost a rite of passage, though most eventually married women and had families. There was a clear pattern. Young men would have relationships with other young men or with older men, and then as they aged, they would marry and take on the active role with younger partners. This raises an interesting question. Were these men what we would call bisexual? Or was this simply a culture where intimate behaviour didn't necessarily align with what we think of as fixed orientation? Remember, medieval people didn't think in terms of orientation or identity. A man could have intimate relations with other men and with women without seeing any contradiction because he wasn't defining himself by his desires or attractions. He was simply engaging in various acts, some acceptable and some not. The gap between rhetoric and reality suggests that while the Church condemned sodomy vehemently, and while the legal penalties were severe on paper, in practice, many people engaged in same-sex relations, and most were never prosecuted. It was an open secret, something everyone knew happened, but that was only occasionally and selectively punished. The system operated with a kind of willful blindness. As long as you were discreet, as long as you fulfilled your social obligations by marrying and producing heirs, as long as you didn't cause public scandal, you might well be left alone. This doesn't mean it was easy or safe. It certainly wasn't. The threat of prosecution was always there, even if it was rarely carried out. The social stigma was real. The religious guilt and fear of damnation were genuine psychological burdens, but it does mean that the medieval world was more complex than the simple story of universal repression might suggest. Chapter 6. The Bigger Picture. So, what does all this tell us about medieval attitudes toward what we now call homosexuality? Well, it's complicated, which is the most honest thing any historian can say about anything, really. But let's try to draw out some broader themes and lessons from this rather tangled history. On one hand, the medieval church's condemnation of sodomy was absolute and uncompromising in its rhetoric. Theologians ranked it among the worst sins a person could commit. Legal codes prescribed death as the penalty. Preachers thundered against it from pulpits across Europe, warning of hellfire and damnation. The official stance was crystal clear. Sodomy was an abomination, a crime against nature, and a sin that cried out to heaven for vengeance. This wasn't subtle or ambiguous. It was as clear a condemnation as you could get. On the other hand, it happened anyway, and with sufficient frequency that authorities had to keep reminding people it was forbidden. It happened in monasteries despite monastic rules specifically designed to prevent it. It happened in royal courts despite political risks. It happened in cities despite special courts established to prosecute it. It happened in universities despite regular warnings from church authorities. The gap between what people were told they should do and what they actually did was substantial. What we see is a society that officially condemned same-sex relations, but unofficially tolerated them to varying degrees, depending on time, place, and social context. This pattern isn't unique to the Middle Ages. Many societies throughout history have operated with this kind of double standard, where official ideology and actual practice exist in tension with each other. The key was discretion. As long as you didn't cause public scandal, as long as you fulfilled your social obligations, you might well be left alone. It's also important to recognize that medieval attitudes weren't monolithic or static. They varied significantly by region. Mediterranean cultures were often more permissive than Northern European ones. They varied by time period. The early Middle Ages were generally less harsh than the later Middle Ages. They varied by social class. Elites often had more freedom than commoners, though they also had more to lose if caught. And they varied by individual. Some bishops and secular rulers enforced the laws strictly, while others turned a blind eye. The medieval period wasn't a single unchanging block of time. Attitudes shifted over the centuries. The 12th century saw a general hardening of attitudes toward various forms of intimate behaviour, part of a broader reform movement within the Church that sought to regulate Christian life more strictly. The establishment of the Inquisition in the 13th century intensified persecution of various deviant behaviours, including sodomy. The late Middle Ages saw increased prosecution and harsher penalties in many regions, though enforcement remained inconsistent. But throughout all of this, people who experienced same-sex desire continued to exist, continued to form relationships, and continued to find ways to live their lives. They didn't have the language we have today to describe their experiences. They didn't have a community or shared identity in the modern sense. They certainly didn't have pride parades or marriage equality or any legal protections whatsoever. What they had was each other, and whatever moments of connection, intimacy and love they could carve out in a world that officially denied their existence. The medieval framework, viewing intimate behaviour as acts rather than identity, had both advantages and disadvantages compared to modern frameworks. The advantage was that no one was defined solely by their intimate desires or behaviours. You weren't a sodomite as a permanent, unchangeable identity. You were a person who might commit sodomy, just as you might commit other sins. There was always the possibility of repentance and redemption. Your actions didn't define your entire being. This framework also meant that what we might call bisexual behaviour was relatively common and unremarkable in some contexts. A man could have intimate relations with both men and women at different points in his life without this being seen as contradictory or requiring explanation. He wasn't violating his identity because identity wasn't the framework being used. However, there were significant disadvantages. If you experienced same-sex attraction, there was no framework for understanding these feelings as natural or innate. You couldn't say, "This is just who I am, and that's perfectly fine." The only explanation available to you was that you were experiencing sinful temptation, which meant something was wrong with you morally or spiritually. There was no way to have a positive self-understanding as someone attracted to the same gender. There was also no community. In the modern world, LGBTQ people can find others like themselves, can build supportive communities, can develop shared culture and identity. Medieval people who experienced same-sex desire had none of this. They were isolated, unable to openly discuss their feelings or experiences, unable to seek support or validation. Each person had to navigate their desires alone, without guidance or role models. The other major disadvantage was the particular erasure of women's experiences. The medieval obsession with male intimate behaviour meant that women's same-sex relationships were largely invisible, which protected them from prosecution but also denied them any recognition or validation. Their stories weren't told, their experiences weren't documented, and they've been largely lost to history. When we talk about medieval homosexuality, we're talking primarily about men because that's what the sources discuss. Women's experiences remain frustratingly obscure. It's also worth considering what the medieval period tells us about the relationship between religion and sexuality. The medieval church's hostility towards same-sex relations wasn't inevitable or universal in Christianity. It developed over time and was influenced by particular theological and social factors. Early Christianity had inherited some attitudes from Judaism and had developed others in response to Greco-Roman culture. The specific medieval framework emerged from centuries of theological development and was shaped by concerns about heresy, social order, and the Church's authority to regulate behaviour. Different Christian communities at different times have had different attitudes towards sexuality. The medieval Catholic Church's position was particularly harsh, but it wasn't the only possible Christian position. This is worth remembering when people claim that Christian opposition to homosexuality is eternal and unchanging. It's actually quite historically contingent and variable. The medieval period also demonstrates that legal prohibition doesn't eliminate behaviour, it just drives it underground and makes it more dangerous for those involved. Despite harsh laws and religious condemnation, same-sex relations continued throughout the Middle Ages. People found ways to connect with each other, to form relationships, to express their desires. Human sexuality is remarkably resistant to social control, which is both encouraging and a reminder of the futility of trying to legislate people's private lives. Another lesson from the medieval period is about the uses of moral panic and how accusations of intimate deviance can be weaponized for political purposes. The frequency with which sodomy accusations were used against political enemies, heretics, and marginalized groups shows how moral rhetoric can be deployed in the service of power. When authorities wanted to destroy someone, sodomy was a convenient accusation because it was so stigmatized and so difficult to definitively disprove. This pattern continues throughout history and remains relevant today. The medieval period also shows us the importance of historical documentation and whose stories get told. The near total silence about women's same-sex relationships isn't because they didn't exist. It's because the people who kept records weren't interested in documenting them. History is always written from particular perspectives, and those perspectives shape what gets preserved and what gets lost. When we study history, we're not accessing some objective truth about the past. We're reading sources created by particular people with particular biases and interests. Finally, the medieval period reminds us that progress isn't linear or inevitable. The ancient world was in many ways more accepting of same-sex relations than the medieval world that followed it. The idea that history moves in a straight line from repression to acceptance is simply not true. Attitudes can become more restrictive as well as more permissive. Rights can be lost as well as gained. The arc of history doesn't automatically bend toward justice. People have to bend it through struggle and activism. This is perhaps the most important lesson. The relative freedom and acceptance that LGBTQ people enjoy in some parts of the modern world isn't a natural endpoint of historical development. It's the result of decades of activism, of people fighting for their rights, of gradual changes in social attitudes. And it's fragile. It can be rolled back, as we've seen in various countries in recent years. The medieval period serves as a reminder of what can happen when religious authorities gain control over intimate morality, and when difference is pathologized as sin. So, what can we take away from this whirlwind tour through medieval sexuality? What does this rather grim history offer us today? For modern LGBTQ people, medieval history offers both cautionary tales and unexpected moments of recognition and even hope. The cautionary tale is obvious. This is what happens when religious institutions gain unchecked power over people's private lives, when difference is treated as sin, when people are denied the language and community to understand their own experiences. The medieval period shows us how damaging it can be when intimate behavior is regulated by authorities more concerned with social control than with human well-being. But there's also something oddly hopeful in the medieval story, if you look for it. Despite everything, despite the laws, despite the church's condemnation, despite the threat of execution, despite the complete lack of any positive framework for understanding same-sex desire, people found each other. They formed relationships. They created moments of love and connection. They found ways to live authentic lives even in the most hostile circumstances. Medieval people who experienced same-sex desire didn't have the language we have today. They didn't have the concept of sexual orientation or identity. They didn't have pride parades or support groups or legal recognition. They didn't have the internet to find others like themselves. They didn't have any of the resources and protections that many LGBTQ people have today, at least in some parts of the world. But they were there. They existed. They loved each other. They found each other somehow in monasteries and courts and universities and cities. They created lives for themselves despite impossible obstacles, and that's worth remembering. When someone tells you that homosexuality is a modern invention, you can tell them about medieval monks and the rules created to keep them apart. You can tell them about Italian cities prosecuting thousands of men, which rather suggests there were thousands of men to prosecute. You can tell them about kings and their favourites, about university students, about all the people whose names we don't know but who left traces in legal records and monastic rules and theological warnings. The medieval period also teaches us about resilience. The people who experienced same-sex desire in the Middle Ages faced challenges we can barely imagine. They lived in a world that denied their very existence, that offered them no positive way to understand themselves, that threatened them with execution if discovered. Yet they persisted. They found ways to survive, to connect, to love. That resilience across centuries is part of LGBTQ history and heritage. For women in particular, the medieval erasure serves as a reminder of how easily women's experiences can be written out of history. The near total silence about women's same-sex relationships isn't because they didn't exist. It's because the people who kept records didn't think women's intimate lives mattered unless they affected men. This erasure continues in various forms today, and lesbian and bisexual women's experiences are still often marginalized even within LGBTQ communities and histories. The medieval period also reminds us to be skeptical of claims about what's natural or traditional. Medieval people were absolutely certain that their understanding of sexuality was natural and God-given and eternal. They were wrong. Their framework was culturally constructed, historically contingent, and variable. The same is true of our modern frameworks. They too are cultural constructs, not eternal truths. Understanding this doesn't mean anything goes, but it does mean we should be humble about claiming our particular cultural moment has figured out the eternal truth about human sexuality. Finally, studying medieval sexuality reminds us why history matters. It's not just about understanding the past for its own sake, though that's valuable too. It's about understanding how we got here, what's changed and what hasn't, what's possible and what's been lost. It's about seeing our current moment not as inevitable or natural, but as one point in a long, complex, ongoing story. Medieval people who experienced same-sex desire were our ancestors in a very real sense, even though we can barely hear their voices across the centuries. They lived and loved in circumstances we can hardly imagine. They navigated impossible situations with whatever grace and courage they could muster. They deserve to be remembered, not as victims or as sinners, but as people, complex, contradictory, fully human people who are part of the great messy tapestry of human experience. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval history, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more LGBTQ history content. Leave a comment letting me know what other periods or topics you'd like me to cover. There's so much more to explore. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and remember, you're part of a story that stretches back through the centuries, even when that story was never written down. But for now, stay tuned for a bonus story read by our guest narrator.
Hello, and thanks for having here. What a wonderful channel. Our next story is called The Doctor Who Cured Housewives with an Ice Pick. I hope you enjoy it. There's a comfortable story we like to tell ourselves about the history of medicine. It's a clean, upward trajectory. A heroic march from leeches and questionable tonics to sterile operating rooms and cures that actually, cure things. We picture a benevolent past, full of serious, pipe-smoking doctors in white coats, nodding thoughtfully as they pioneered new ways to alleviate human suffering. The whole enterprise, we assume, was guided by that one simple, unimpeachable principle. First, do no harm. It's a nice thought. It's a reassuring thought. It's the sort of thought that helps you trust the system. And it's a complete fantasy. The truth is, for a terrifyingly long stretch of the 20th century, the medical establishment, particularly the burgeoning field of psychiatry, was less a meticulous science and more a wild improvisational jam session with human brains as the instruments. And if you happen to be a woman who is a little too sad, a little too outspoken, a little too tired of scrubbing floors, or just generally inconvenient, you were the prime candidate for the band's horrifying new hit single. The prevailing medical wisdom of the day wasn't about healing you. It was about making you more manageable for everyone else. It was a social tool disguised as a medical procedure. The whole thing was based on a lie. Tonight, you are that inconvenience. The year is 1952, and you live in a brand new house in a quiet, manicured suburb where the lawns are as uniform as the expectations. You are a wife, a mother, and according to a very confident man in a suit, you are mentally ill. Your symptoms? You sometimes cry after your husband leaves for work. You have opinions about politics that you occasionally share. You once expressed a desire to finish the college degree you abandoned to get married. In the eyes of modern medicine, these are not signs of a complex inner life or a stifled intellect. They are dangerous malfunctions in the domestic machinery. And a doctor has just promised your husband a quick, permanent, and revolutionary fix. You were one of thousands of American women deemed too difficult to handle. And your cure was to be a 10-minute procedure involving an ice pick. The proof of your story isn't buried in a tomb or hidden in a dusty archive. It's resting in medical museums and private collections, looking deceptively simple, almost mundane. It's a leucotome, or more famously, an orbitoclast. To the untrained eye, it looks like a common ice pick, the kind you'd find in a kitchen drawer, just a bit more slender, a bit more menacingly elegant. It's a steel stylus with a sharp point and markings along the shaft to measure depth. This simple tool is the archaeological receipt for one of the most brutal chapters in medical history. It's the physical evidence that a celebrated physician could travel the country in a van he called his low-boda mobile, armed with little more than this and a carpenter's mallet, and permanently alter the brains of tens of thousands of people, many of whom were women like you, whose only real crime was being unhappy. This discovery, made not in a single dig, but through the painstaking work of medical historians unearthing case files and patient records, reveals something extraordinary about the intersection of social control and medical science. As we settle in tonight, we're going to uncover not just what archaeologists of the recent past found, but what it tells us about the surprisingly relatable lives of people who lived in post-war America. Now dim the lights and prepare to discover why this story will change how you think about the quiet confidence of a man with a cure. Your day begins with the sun, or rather, just before it. The light is a weak, milky gray, filtering through the starched gingham curtains in your bedroom. It's the same light as yesterday, and the day before that. The first sound is the quiet hum of the new refrigerator downstairs, a marvel of modern engineering. A constant, low reminder of the humming, efficient life you are supposed to be living. You lie still for a moment, listening to your husband's steady, untroubled breathing beside you. His name is Frank, or maybe it's Bill, or Robert. It doesn't really matter. He is a good man. Everyone says so. He works hard at his accounting firm. He doesn't drink to excess. He provides. He provides this house, this bed, this life. In return, you are to provide a clean home, hot meals, well-behaved children, and a serene, smiling presence. A simple transaction. A fair deal. So why do you feel this hollow ache deep in your chest before your feet even touch the floor? You slide out of bed, careful not to wake him. The floorboards are cool. You move through the silent house like a ghost. Your routine so ingrained, it requires no thought. Your body knows the steps, down the stairs, into the kitchen. The linoleum is spotless because you scrubbed it on your hands and knees 2 days ago. You start the coffee percolator, the gentle bubbling a countdown to the morning's frantic energy. You lay out your husband's clothes. You pack his lunch, a roast beef sandwich on white bread, an apple, a cellophane-wrapped cookie. You wake the children. You wrestle them into their clothes, coax them through breakfast, a blur of spilled milk and frantic searching for a lost shoe. You do it all with a practiced calm, a placid expression you've perfected in the bathroom mirror. It's a mask, and some days it feels heavier than others. Today it feels like lead. This is the central conflict of your existence, though you don't have the words for it. You are living the dream. You have seen the advertisements in Life magazine. The smiling woman with her gleaming new Hoover vacuum, the contented family gathered around the television set. You have all of it. The washing machine, the tidy garden, the 2 healthy children. You should be happy. The fact that you are not, that you feel a persistent, knowing sense of something else, is therefore not a flaw in the dream itself. It must be a flaw in you. A loose wire, a faulty connection somewhere in your brain. Your husband kisses you at the door, his mind already on spreadsheets and client meetings. He tells you to have a good day. The children leave for school, a whirlwind of noise and energy that vanishes as the big yellow bus rumbles away down the street. And then, silence. A profound, echoing silence that fills every corner of the house. It's just you and the humming refrigerator. The house is a pristine museum of a happy life, and you are its lonely, anxious curator. You walk through the rooms, straightening a picture frame here, fluffing a pillow there. You see your reflection in the polished surface of the dining room table. A woman in a simple house dress, her hair neatly coiffed. She looks like the woman in the advertisements. But her eyes are haunted by a question she's not allowed to ask. Is this all there is? Sometimes you sit by the window and just watch the world go by. You see other women pushing strollers, hanging laundry, living the same life. They smile and wave. Are they pretending to? Or are you the only one who feels this way? This thought is the most dangerous of all. The idea that you are uniquely broken. You remember college. You were studying literature. You loved the smell of old books in the library, the thrill of dissecting a line of poetry, the feeling that your mind was expanding, connecting with great thinkers across centuries. You were good at it. A professor once told you that you had a truly original mind. You tucked that compliment away like a pressed flower in a book, something to be taken out and looked at in secret. Frank thought your studies were a nice hobby, something to keep you busy until the real business of marriage and family began. Now, your reading is confined to housekeeping magazines and the latest Reader's Digest. The books on your shelf are for decoration. To pick one up feels like an act of defiance. Last week, you did. You sat down in the middle of the afternoon, with laundry waiting in the basket, and read a chapter of a novel. It felt illicit, thrilling, and deeply selfish. When you heard your husband's car in the driveway, you hid the book under a sofa cushion, your heart pounding with a ridiculous, unearned guilt. This is your life, a series of small, quiet suffocations. And the pressure has been building. It isn't one big thing that finally makes the system crack. It's 1,000 tiny paper cuts to the soul. It's the condescending way your husband pats your head when you try to discuss the news. It's the forced cheerfulness at neighborhood potlucks, where the conversation never strays from recipes and children's report cards. It's the creeping, insidious feeling that you are becoming invisible, that the person you once were, the girl with the original mind, is fading away, being replaced by this smiling, efficient automaton. One afternoon, the dam breaks. Your youngest child spills a glass of grape juice on the new beige carpet. It's not a catastrophe. It's a simple, everyday accident. But in that moment, the dark purple stain feels like a physical manifestation of all the messages you keep bottled up inside. You don't yell. You don't scream. You simply sit down on the floor and begin to cry. Not delicate, feminine tears, but huge, racking sobs that shake your entire body. You cry for the spilled juice, for the forgotten books, for the silent afternoons, for the person you are not allowed to be. You cry until you can't breathe. Your husband comes home to find you like this, red-eyed and empty on the living room floor. He doesn't see a woman overwhelmed by a profound existential despair. He sees a malfunction, a problem to be solved. He helps you to your feet, his expression a mixture of pity and frustration. He tells you that you're just tired, that you've been working too hard. He calls it a spell. He uses the word hysterical, not with malice, but with the simple, unthinking certainty of a man repeating a diagnosis he's heard 1,000 times. Hysteria, the catch-all term for female emotion that is inconvenient or difficult to understand. It's a diagnosis that requires no investigation, only a solution. He tells you he knows a doctor, a specialist, a brilliant man who is doing wonderful new things for people with nerves like yours. He says it with the hopeful air of someone who has found the perfect repairman for a broken appliance. You try to protest. You try to explain that you're not sick. You're just unhappy. But the word itself sounds childish, selfish. Unhappiness, in this world of gleaming prosperity, is a moral failing. Your attempts to articulate the complex web of social pressure and intellectual starvation you feel are dismissed as rambling, further proof of your unbalanced mind. The appointment is made. You don't have a choice. The path has been chosen for you, and it is leading you out of your home and into the cool, sterile world of modern psychiatric medicine. And you have a terrible, sinking feeling that you will not be coming back the same. The doctor's office is nothing like you expect. It's not a dark, gothic asylum from a novel. It's bright, modern, and decorated in soothing shades of mint green and beige. It's meant to be calming, but the effect is deeply unsettling. It's the kind of placid environment that makes you feel like you're the only thing in the room that's out of place. You sit on a firm leather chair, your hands twisting a handkerchief in your lap. Your husband sits beside you, looking relieved, as if merely being here has already solved half the problem. He does all the talking. He describes your symptoms to the doctor. You're weepy. You're anxious. You're sometimes sullen and withdrawn. He mentions the book you are reading in secret, framing it not as an intellectual pursuit, but as a sign of you drifting off from your duties. He tells the doctor you've become argumentative lately, that you question his decisions. He calls it defiance. You listen as your entire inner life is pathologized, every normal human emotion twisted into a clinical symptom. Your sadness becomes melancholia. Your frustration becomes agitation. Your intelligence becomes neurotic obsession. The doctor, a man with kind eyes and an unnervingly steady smile, nods along, taking notes on a small pad. He doesn't look at you much. He looks at your husband. He is diagnosing the problem as it is presented to him, a malfunctioning wife. When he finally turns to you, his questions are simple and impossible to answer. Why are you so unhappy, my dear? You have a lovely home, a good husband. He says it all with a gentle, patronizing tone that makes you want to scream. How do you explain the crushing weight of 1,000 unspoken expectations? How do you describe the grief of a mind left to atrophy? You try. You talk about feeling trapped, about wanting more from your life than clean floors and perfectly cooked roasts. The doctor just smiles that placid, knowing smile. He writes on his notepad. He then turns back to your husband and begins to speak in a low, conspiratorial tone, as if you're a child who can't understand the adult conversation happening right in front of you. He uses words like psychosurgery and anxiety state. He explains that your brain, through no fault of your own, has developed faulty circuits, unhealthy pathways of thought that have become stuck in a loop. He compares it to a tangled phone line where the messages are getting crossed. A beautifully simple mechanical analogy for the messy, complex reality of a human soul. And then he offers the solution, a revolutionary new procedure. It's quick, he says, almost painless. It doesn't even require a long hospital stay. He calls it a transorbital lobotomy. He describes how he can access the frontal lobes of the brain through the eye sockets. He doesn't use the word ice pick, of course. He uses the clinical term, orbitoclast. He explains that with a few swift, precise movements, he can sever those tangled, troublesome connections. He can snip the wires that are causing all this distress. He promises that you will be calmer, more placid, happier. He says you'll be the wife your husband remembers, the woman you were meant to be. He is selling a cure, and it sounds so simple, so scientific, so modern. Your husband, desperate for a fix, for the return of the simple, smiling wife he thought he married, latches on to this promise with fervent gratitude. He sees this doctor not as a man proposing to permanently damage your brain with a sharp instrument, but as a savior, a miracle worker. You try to speak, but your voice is a whisper. I don't want this, you say. The doctor looks at you with that same infuriatingly gentle pity. "Of course you don't, my dear," he says. "The sickness is telling you that. It doesn't want to be cured. Your opinion is irrelevant. Your fear is just another symptom. Your consent is not required. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of medicine, your husband is your guardian, and he has consented on your behalf. The decision has been made. The date is set for next Tuesday. You are being sent away to have your personality surgically removed, and it's all being done for your own good." You drive home in a thick, suffocating silence. Your husband pats your hand and tells you everything is going to be all right. You look out the window at the passing rows of identical houses with their identical green lawns, and you feel a terror so profound it has no sound. You are a ghost already, and you're just waiting for the procedure to make it official. The days leading up to the procedure are surreal. You move through your life as if watching it from a great distance. You make the beds. You cook the meals. You hug your children, and a part of you is desperately trying to memorize the feeling, the smell of their hair, the warmth of their small bodies. You try to explain to them that mommy has to go away for a little while to get better, but the words feel like a lie. You're not getting better. You're being erased. You look in the mirror and try to see the person they say you are. The sick woman, the hysterical wife. But you just see yourself. You see the fear in your own eyes, and you wonder if anyone else can see it. No one seems to notice. The neighborhood women smile and wave. Your husband treats you with a new kind of gentle, careful solicitude, as if you're a fragile object that's about to be sent away for repair. The world continues on its axis, oblivious to the quiet violence that is about to be committed against your mind. On the morning of the procedure, you are not taken to a hospital. You are driven to a private clinic, a stately old house converted for medical use. It's all very discreet. Inside, the nurses are efficient and impersonal. They take your coat, your purse. They ask you to change into a thin cotton gown. Everything is white. The walls, the sheets, the uniforms. A sterile, colorless world. You are led to a small room with a bed and a single chair. There are no flowers, no pictures on the wall. It is a room scrubbed clean of all personality, a fitting prelude for what is about to happen to you. You lie on the bed and stare at the ceiling. The minutes stretch into an eternity. You can hear the muffled sounds of the clinic around you, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes, the distant ringing of a telephone. It all sounds impossibly normal. A nurse comes in to take your blood pressure. She doesn't make eye contact. You are not a person to her. You are a patient, a task on her list for the day. You want to ask her what it will be like. Will it hurt? Will you still be you afterwards? But you can't form the words. Your throat is tight with a fear that is beyond language. Then the door opens and the doctor enters. He is not wearing a white coat, but a sharp suit. He carries a small, leather-bound case, like a musician carrying a prized instrument. He smiles that same calm, confident smile you remember from his office. He is followed by an assistant. He doesn't speak to you. He speaks to his assistant, his voice low and professional. He is the master of this domain, the expert craftsman preparing for his work. He opens the case. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, are his tools. And for the first time, you see it, the orbitoclast, the ice pick. It looks so small, so simple, so utterly inadequate for the monumental task it is about to perform. Beside it is a small mallet, the kind a carpenter might use for tapping things gently into place. The juxtaposition is grotesque. A tool of crude construction and a tool of brutal destruction, lying side by side. This is the archaeological evidence of your cure. This is the artifact that tells the whole story. Future generations might find this in a museum and wonder at its purpose. They wouldn't be able to guess the sheer scale of the hubris it represents. The belief that the infinite complexity of a human personality could be fixed with a hammer and a metal spike. They don't give you a general anesthetic. That would take too long, and this doctor has a busy schedule. He's a pioneer of efficiency. Instead, you are sedated, or sometimes subjected to electroconvulsive therapy right before the procedure to induce a seizure and render you unconscious. Let's imagine, for tonight, that you are just conscious enough to be aware. A heavy, sluggish feeling overtakes you. Your limbs feel like lead. Your thoughts are slow, syrupy. You are aware of what is happening, but as if through a thick pane of glass. The doctor pulls back your eyelid. You feel the cold, metallic pressure as he inserts the point of the orbitoclast between your eyeball and the lid, aiming for the thin bone of the orbital plate. This is the gateway, the back door to your soul. He takes the mallet. You hear a sharp, sickening tap, a sound like a rock cracking, but it's inside your own head. The bone gives way. The pick is in. It has breached the wall of your skull and is now resting in the soft, vulnerable tissue of your frontal lobe, the part of your brain that holds your personality, your creativity, your ambition, your ability to plan, to dream, the very essence of you. He doesn't look like a surgeon. He looks like a man trying to open a stubborn can of paint. He moves the pick back and forth, a swishing, sweeping motion. He is severing the connections. He is scrambling the signals. He is disconnecting you from yourself. He is not a healer. He is a vandal. He withdraws the instrument, and you feel a strange, wet release of pressure. Then he moves to the other eye and does it all over again. Tap, crack, swish. The entire procedure takes less than 10 minutes. He is a master of his craft. He has performed this operation thousands of times in pristine clinics and in the back rooms of state asylums. He even traveled the country in a custom-fitted van, a mobile lobotomy unit he jokingly called his Lobotomobile, bringing his 10-minute cure to the masses. When he is finished, he wipes the instrument clean, places it back in its velvet nest, and closes the case. His work here is done. He has another patient waiting. He gives a brief, satisfied nod to his assistant and leaves the room. He does not check on you. The nurses will handle that. The cleanup. They place small bandages over your eyes, which are already beginning to swell and blacken. You lie there in the white room, a profound and terrifying stillness descending upon you. The tangled phone lines have been cut. The messages are no longer getting crossed. In fact, very few messages are getting through at all. The line is quiet. The silence you once dreaded in your empty house has now taken up permanent residence inside your skull. The recovery is quick, just as the doctor promised. There's no lengthy convalescence. After a few hours, you are helped into a wheelchair and taken out to your husband's car. He is waiting, his face etched with anxious hope. He looks at your bandaged, bruised eyes and flinches, but the nurse reassures him that the swelling will go down. She tells him you will be docile for a while, perhaps a little confused, but that this is normal. She uses the word placid, a good word, a desirable state. The drive home is a blur. You don't speak. The world outside the car window seems flat, two-dimensional. The colors are less vibrant. The hollow ache in your chest is gone. But it hasn't been replaced with happiness. It's been replaced with nothing. A vast, calm, empty space. You arrive home, and your husband helps you inside. The house looks the same, but it feels different. It no longer feels oppressive. It doesn't feel like anything. It's just a place. A collection of furniture in a series of rooms. Your children run to you, but you don't feel that familiar surge of overwhelming love and anxiety. You register their presence. You know they are your children. You allow them to hug you. Your arms go around them in a learned mechanical motion. But the deep, fierce connection, the thing that made you weep with fear for their future and burst with pride at their small accomplishments, it's gone. Or at least, it's buried so deep you can no longer access it. In the weeks that follow, Your husband declares the procedure a resounding success. You no longer cry. You no longer argue or express inconvenient opinions. You do the housework with a quiet, uncomplaining efficiency. You are a perfect hostess. You smile at the appropriate times. You are, by all external measures, cured. Your husband can finally relax. The appliance has been repaired. The domestic machinery is running smoothly again. He tells his friends that the doctor is a genius, a miracle worker. But you know the truth. You are a prisoner in the calm, tsaric country of your own mind. The parts of you that made you you, your passion, your intellect, your wit, your sorrow, your yearning for something more, have been surgically excised. They were the symptoms of your disease, and the cure was to eliminate them. You can still access memories. You remember reading books. You remember wanting to be a writer. You remember feeling despair. But you remember them the way you might remember a story you read about someone else. The emotional connection is gone. They are just facts, stripped of all meaning. Sometimes, in a quiet moment, a flicker of the old you tries to break through the fog. A ghost in the machine. You might see a particular slant of light, or hear a piece of music that triggers a faint, distant echo of a feeling. But it's like trying to catch smoke. It's there, and then it's gone, and the placid emptiness rushes back in to fill the void. You have been made manageable. You have been rendered harmless. And in the process, you have been erased. You are the final living artifact of the procedure. A walking testament to a time when the cure for a woman's soul was a hammer, a spike, and the devastating belief that a quiet woman was a healthy woman. Your story was not unique. Between the late 1930s and the 1970s, an estimated 50,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States alone. And while men were certainly subjected to the procedure, a hugely disproportionate number of patients were women. Women diagnosed with everything from schizophrenia to postpartum depression to simple nervous tension or anxiety. It became a tool not just for managing the severely mentally ill, but for enforcing social norms. It was the ultimate patriarchal weapon, wielded by a medical establishment that saw female complexity as a disease to be eradicated. The man who perfected and popularized the ice pick lobotomy, Dr. Walter Freeman, was a showman. He was a crusader who genuinely believed he was helping people. He saw the overcrowded state asylums, the suffering, and he believed he had a simple, elegant solution. He wanted to get patients out of institutions and back to their families. And if they went back as blunted, childlike versions of their former selves, well, that was a small price to pay for an empty hospital bed and a quiet home. He was a man of his time, embodying both its scientific ambition and its profound, terrifying ignorance about the human mind. His confidence was absolute, his methods were brutal, and his legacy is a field of silent, hollowed-out lives. The fall of the lobotomy was not swift. It didn't come from a sudden moral awakening in the medical community. It came, as these things often do, from the invention of something better, or at least something easier and more profitable. The development of the first effective antipsychotic drugs in the mid-1950s, like Thorazine, offered a new way to manage patients. A chemical lobotomy instead of a surgical one. It was cheaper, less visibly brutal, and infinitely more scalable. The ice pick was retired, not because it was recognized as a barbaric act of mutilation, but because it was rendered obsolete by the pill. It became a relic, a chilling footnote in the grand, heroic story of medicine. But for you, and for the tens of thousands like you, the story doesn't end. You live out your days in the quiet aftermath. Perhaps you grow old in that same suburban house, a placid, smiling grandmother whose grandchildren find her a little distant, a little strange. They don't know the story of the brilliant, passionate young woman you once were. They don't know that your mind is a historical site, a place where a great and terrible violence was done in the name of peace and quiet. They don't know that the serene emptiness in your eyes was not a gift of old age, but a wound inflicted in your youth, a scar left by a man with a hammer and a cure. You exist as a living reminder that the line between healing and harm can be perilously thin, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is a simple solution to a complex problem. As our journey through the chilling history of psychosurgery concludes tonight, we're reminded that the past is far from dusty and dull. It's a vibrant, often surprising, and always intriguing tapestry, woven with human ingenuity, resilience, and the occasional ancient mystery that still makes us wonder. The artifacts left behind, whether a clay pot or a surgeon's tool, tell us stories not just about what people did, but about what they believed, what they feared, and how they tried, sometimes with devastating consequences, to make sense of the world. This is the Sleeping Archaeologist, encouraging you to remain curious about the incredible tales still waiting to be discovered beneath our feet. Our next story is called The Typhoon That Didn't Save Japan, But Took All the Credit. I hope you enjoy it. Let's be honest for a moment. History, as it's often told, loves a simple story. It loves a good, clean, Hollywood-friendly narrative with a clear hero, a dastardly villain, and a dramatic last-minute plot twist that saves the day. And when it comes to the story of the Mongol invasions of Japan, the script seems to write itself. A small, noble island of samurai warriors stands against the largest, most terrifying empire on earth. Just when all seems lost, the very heavens intervene, unleashing a mythical storm, a divine wind that obliterates the enemy fleet in a single cinematic swoop. It's a fantastic tale. It's got God's guts and glory. It's the kind of thing you'd tell around a campfire to make everyone feel a little bit better about their odds. The problem is, like most stories that seem a little too perfect, it's mostly nonsense. It's the historical equivalent of saying you won a marathon because you found a great parking spot near the finish line. It conveniently ignores the grueling, bloody, exhausting 26 miles you ran beforehand. The idea that Japan was saved by a fluke, a meteorological miracle, is a profound disservice to the thousands of people who spent years preparing, fighting, and bleeding on the beaches of Hakata Bay. It was a victory earned through sheer grit, ingenious engineering, and a whole lot of terror-fueled hard work. The storm wasn't the hero of the story. It was the closing credits. The old way of thinking was completely wrong. Tonight, you are a part of that story. The year is 1281. You are a Gokunin a vassal samurai, and your boots are filled with the same gritty sand you've been staring at for 7 long years. You're not a pristine warrior from a woodblock print. You're tired, you're jumpy, and your back aches from a particularly unglamorous project, building a wall. This isn't a story about divine intervention. This is a story about logistics, terror, and the surprising effectiveness of good, old-fashioned construction. And out on the horizon, the largest naval invasion fleet the world has ever seen is blotting out the sun, aimed directly at you and the stone wall you've spent the better part of a decade building. The divine winds haven't arrived yet. You have. The proof, the hard receipts for this revised version of history, lay at the bottom of the sea for nearly 700 years. Off the coast of Takashima Island, marine archaeologists found the graveyard of that very fleet. And what they found wasn't the wreckage of a mighty armada smote by an angry god. It was something far more telling. They found the anchors, hundreds of them, hastily made and far too light for ships of that size. They found the waterlogged hulls of flat-bottomed riverboats, the nautical equivalent of taking a station wagon off-roading in the mountains, forced into service on the open ocean. And most importantly, they found the weapons: crossbow bolts, armor fragments, and little ceramic spheres called *Tetsu*. These were ceramic grenades, filled with gunpowder and iron shrapnel, designed to explode and spread terror. The discovery of these artifacts wasn't just a discovery of old stuff. It was the unearthing of a more complex, more human, and far more interesting story. It proved the invasion was a frantic, jerry-rigged, and desperate affair, and that the fight on the beaches was a terrifying, modern, and explosive battle, long before the first gust of wind ever arrived. This discovery, made in the waters off Japan in the late 20th century, reveals something extraordinary about military history and the nature of national myths. As we settle in tonight, we're going to uncover not just what archaeologists found, but what it tells us about the surprisingly relatable lives of people who lived in 13th century Japan. Now dim the lights and prepare to discover why this story will change how you think about the legendary kamikaze. Let's set the scene. Before the ships, before the wall, before the all-consuming dread, there was just quiet. You live in a world governed by a system that feels both ancient and immediate. You are a *Gokunin*, a houseman, a direct vassal to the Kamakura shogunate. This isn't a job title. It's your entire identity. Your family has held land for generations, and in exchange for that land, you owe military service. It's a simple contract, really. The shogun, who is the real power behind the often ceremonial emperor in Kyoto, gives you a place in the world, and in return, you show up with a sharp sword and a willing attitude when he calls. For most of your life, that call has been for local squabbles, policing duties, or disputes with a neighboring clan over who has the rights to a particularly productive rice paddy. It's a life of ritual, duty, and the kind of low-level agricultural anxiety that has defined human existence for millennia. Then the letters start arriving. They come from the mainland, from a man whose name is spoken in whispers, a name that carries the weight of a continent, Kublai Khan, grandson of the great Genghis Khan. His Mongol empire is less a country and more a force of nature. It has swallowed China, Korea, Persia. It stretches from the Pacific to the edge of Europe. It is the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. And now its gaze has fallen on you. The letters are, well, they're not exactly friendly. They are the 13th century equivalent of an email from corporate headquarters with the subject line, urgent. A new opportunity for synergy, which everyone knows means do what we say or your entire department will be eliminated. The letters demand that Japan submit, become a tributary state, and acknowledge the supreme authority of the great Khan. They speak of the Khan's vast and glorious empire and the futility of resistance. The response from your leaders in Kamakura is a masterclass in passive aggression. They essentially leave the Khan on read. They don't say no. They just don't say yes. They debate, they dither. They send the messengers back with non-committal replies. And finally, they just stop responding altogether. To you, on your coastal estate in Kyushu, the southern island closest to the mainland, this diplomatic chess match feels impossibly distant. You hear rumors, of course. Travelers and merchants speak of the terrifying power of the Mongols, of entire cities wiped from the earth. But it's abstract. It's someone else's problem. Until it isn't. The year is 1274, and the Khan's patience has, it seems, finally run out. One autumn morning, you are pulled from your routine by the watchman's gongs. It starts as a low rhythmic clang, then builds to a frantic, chaotic alarm. You pull on your armor lamellar plates of leather and steel, laced together with silk cords. It's heavy, familiar, a second skin you've trained in since you were a boy. You grab your Yumi asterisk, the long asymmetrical bow that is the soul of samurai warfare, and your Tachi asterisk, the long curved sword that is its heart. You race to the coast, your retainers following, your mind cycling through the possibilities. A pirate raid? A rival lord making a bold move? What you see when you reach the cliffs overlooking Hakata Bay stops your breath. The horizon is gone. It has been replaced by ships. Not 10, not 20, hundreds. At least 900 vessels, a forest of masts and sails, moving with a chilling unified purpose. They are unlike any ships you have ever seen. They are massive, imposing, and they carry an army of over 30,000 men Mongols, Chinese and Koreans, a multinational force of conquest cobbled together from the Khan's vast domains. The abstract threat has just become horrifyingly real. It is floating in your bay. You and the other local samurai are catastrophically outnumbered. The shogunate's central armies are days away. You are the front line. You are the only line. The landings begin. The Mongol tactics are alien and terrifying. Your way of war is built on honor and individual prowess. A samurai seeks out a worthy opponent, announces his name and lineage, and engages in a duel. It is a dance of skill and bravery. The Mongols have no time for such niceties. They advance in disciplined, tight formations, hiding behind massive shields. They move as one entity, a wave of steel and leather. When you fire an arrow, they raise their shields in unison. When you charge, they unleash a volley of arrows that darkens the sky. And their arrows are different. The tips are barbed, and you discover with horror, dipped in poison. A scratch can mean a slow, agonizing death. But that isn't the worst of it. The worst is the sound. It's a sharp crack, a sudden explosion that rips through the air, followed by a shower of iron shrapnel. You see men scream and fall, clutching at wounds from an invisible enemy. These are the Tetsu*, the ceramic grenades you now know archaeologists would one day pull from the mud. To you, it is black magic. It is thunder conjured from a clay pot. It bypasses armor, it breaks formations, and more than anything, it shatters morale. How do you fight an enemy who throws thunder? You fight with desperate courage. You charge their lines, trying to break through and engage them in the close-quarters combat, where your swordsmanship gives you an advantage. The fighting on the beach is a chaotic, brutal scrum. The sand turns red. The air fills with the screams of men and the terrifying, alien sound of Mongol war drums. You are not a hero in a grand epic. You are a terrified man trying to protect his home, watching his friends and relatives fall to weapons you don't understand. By the end of the day, you and the other defenders have been pushed back, forced to retreat from the coast. You've inflicted casualties, yes, but you've been battered. You take refuge in a makeshift fortress inland, expecting the final, overwhelming assault to come with the dawn. You fall into an exhausted, dreamless sleep, convinced you are going to die tomorrow. But the dawn comes, and with it, silence. The war drums are gone. The battle cries have ceased. Cautiously, you move back towards the coast. The Mongol army is gone. The entire fleet has vanished. As you stand on the ravaged beach, looking out at an empty sea, a storm begins to roll in. Not a typhoon, not a great divine wind, but a nasty, brutal autumn squall. It's then that the story begins to form, whispered among the exhausted survivors. The gods, the Kami asterisk, have intervened. They sent a storm to drive the invaders away. It's a comforting thought. It gives meaning to the slaughter. It transforms a terrifying, confusing defeat into a narrative of divine protection. The reality, as historians and tacticians now understand it, was far more pragmatic. The Mongol force had achieved its objective. They had landed, shattered the local defenses, and proven their overwhelming superiority. But they were an expeditionary force, far from home, with a finite supply of arrows and thunderpots. They had taken casualties, and their commander was wounded. The prudent military decision was to withdraw to their ships for the night, regroup, and plan the next stage of the campaign from the safety of their fleet. The approaching storm simply hurried that decision along. They weren't defeated by a storm. They made a tactical withdrawal and then got caught in some bad weather on the way home, losing a couple hundred ships. It wasn't a miracle. It was a warning. The Mongols had just taken a practice swing, and you, standing on that beach, knew with a certainty that chilled you to the bone. They would be back. You didn't know when, but you knew it was coming. And next time, They wouldn't be testing the waters. They'd be coming to boil the ocean. The 7 years that followed the first invasion were not years of peace. They were years of cold, simmering dread. The victory of 1274 felt hollow. You knew everyone knew that you hadn't won. You had survived the first round. The Khan was not a man to accept being ignored, and now he was a man who had been repelled. His pride was wounded, and the pride of a Mongol Khan was a dangerous thing. The entire nation held its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Your life and the lives of every other coastal asterisk Gokunin asterisk was transformed. The quiet life of managing your estate was over. You were now a full-time soldier in a war that hadn't officially started yet. The Kamakura shogunate, shaken from its diplomatic dithering, went into overdrive. Their response was not to build more temples or offer more prayers, though they certainly did that too. Their primary response was far more practical and far more exhausting for you. It was a construction project, a massive one. You are ordered to contribute men, resources, and your own sweat to the building of a great defensive wall along the coast of Hakata Bay, the asterisk Genko Borui asterisk. It's not a grand, towering fortification like the Great Wall of China. It's a more modest affair, a stone barrier about 2 meters high, and in some places just as thick. It stretches for 20 kilometers, following the curve of the bay where the Mongols had landed so easily before. For you, this is now your life's work. You are no longer just a warrior. You are a foreman, a laborer, a quarryman. Days are spent under the hot Kyushu sun, or in the whipping winter wind, hauling stones. Your hands, once calloused from the bowstring and the sword's grip, are now raw from rock and rope. The air is thick with stone dust that cakes in your throat and your nostrils. You watch as thousands of men, samurai and peasants alike, toil to raise this barrier. It's slow, backbreaking, unglamorous work. There is no honor in it, no glory to be won. It is the mundane, physical labor of survival. Every stone you place is a silent prayer, a desperate hope that this will be enough. This wall is the physical manifestation of Japan's fear, and it's also a source of deep resentment. The shogunate is demanding everything from its vassals. You are expected to maintain a constant watch on the coast, to fund the wall's construction, and to keep yourself and your retainers ready for a war that could start any day. But the shogunate offers little in return. In the past, victory in battle meant rewards, new lands, titles, wealth taken from the defeated enemy. But in this war, there is no enemy land to conquer. There is no treasure to be won. Victory means only that you get to keep what you already have. Survival is the only prize. This places an immense strain on the entire asterisk Gokunin asterisk system. Many families are bankrupting themselves to fulfill their duties. You sell off heirlooms, mortgage your lands, and cut back on every expense to keep your men armed and fed. A quiet bitterness begins to grow. You are sacrificing everything for a victory that will offer no reward. The years tick by. 1275, 1276, 1277. The wall grows, stone by agonizing stone. Every ship that appears on the horizon sends a jolt of adrenaline through the coastal garrisons. Is this it? Is this the day? Most of the time, it's just a fishing boat or a merchant vessel. The constant state of high alert is mentally and emotionally draining. It's a war of nerves, a siege of the soul. You train relentlessly. You practice with the bow until your shoulders scream. You study the reports from the first invasion, trying to understand the Mongol tactics. You learn about their coordinated formations, their use of cavalry, and their terrifying explosive weapons. The fear of the unknown from the first battle is replaced by the fear of the known. You now know exactly what you are up to against, and you know it will be worse next time. In 1279, the news you have been dreading finally arrives, trickling in from spies and traders on the mainland. The Khan has completed his conquest of southern China. The Song dynasty, which had resisted the Mongols for decades, has finally fallen. This is catastrophic news. It means two things. First, the Khan now has the full, undivided attention of his military machine to focus on Japan. There are no other distractions. Second, and perhaps more terrifyingly, he now possesses the entire shipbuilding capacity of southern China, one of the greatest maritime powers in the world. He has access to their technology, their shipyards, and most importantly, their sailors. The resources available for the next invasion are now functionally limitless. The waiting is almost over. The tension along the coast becomes unbearable. Every man is on edge. You find yourself looking at your sons, some of whom were infants during the first invasion, and who are now old enough to wear armor themselves. You wonder if this wall, this thing you have poured your life and fortune into for 7 years, will be their tomb. You stand atop the finished sections of the asterisk Jenko Borui asterisk, looking out at the calm blue water of the bay. The wall feels small, insignificant against the vastness of the ocean. It feels like a child's sandcastle, a futile gesture against the coming tide. You've done everything you can. You've prepared, you've trained, you've built. Now there is nothing left to do but wait for the storm to break. You don't realize how literal that sentiment is about to become. The summer of 1281 is hot and humid. The air is thick, promising storms that never seem to arrive. And then, one day in June, the watchman's gongs begin to sound again. But this time, the frantic rhythm is different. It's deeper, more resonant, filled with a sense of finality. This is it. You scramble to your post atop the wall, your heart a cold stone in your chest. And you see it. It's not an armada. It's a floating continent. The First Fleet, the Eastern Route Army, has arrived from Korea. It consists of 900 ships, just like the first invasion. But this time, it's just the appetizer. You know, from intelligence reports, that a second, even larger fleet is on its way. The main fleet, sailing from southern China, with over 3,500 ships and 100,000 men. In total, Kublai Khan is throwing an invasion force of nearly 150,000 soldiers at your shores. It is without exaggeration the largest and most powerful naval invasion in the history of the world, a record that will stand unbroken for nearly 700 years, until the D-Day landings in Normandy. The sight is demoralizing. It is designed to be. The sheer scale of it is a weapon in itself, meant to crush your will to fight before the first soldier ever steps ashore. From your position on the wall, the sea simply looks like a solid mass of wood and sail. The gap between the horizon and the coast is filled. The Mongols make their initial landings on outlying islands, methodically crushing the small garrisons there. Then they turn their full attention to Hakata Bay, to you. The battle for the coast begins. And immediately, you understand the value of the last 7 years of backbreaking labor. The wall works. It works brilliantly. The long, open beaches of 1274 are gone. The Mongol forces cannot simply storm the shore in a wide front. They are forced to disembark from their large ships onto smaller boats and attempt to land in the few gaps in the wall or try to scale it under fire. This completely negates their primary advantage, their cavalry. There is no room to maneuver horses, no space to form their disciplined ranks. Instead of an open battle, the conflict becomes a brutal, grinding meat grinder. You and your fellow samurai stand atop the wall, firing arrows down into the landing parties. The cramped conditions favor you, the defenders. You are protected by the stone, firing from a stable, elevated platform. The invaders are exposed, packed into small boats, struggling through the surf. It is a slaughter. When they do manage to reach the base of the wall, the fighting becomes a desperate, close-quarters affair. You lean over the ramparts, stabbing down with spears and naginatas, while they try to find purchase on the stones. all while the air is filled with the crack and boom of their asterisk TETSU, how asterisk. The days blur into a hellish routine of screaming, clanging steel, and the smell of blood and gunpowder. You fight all day, and at night you conduct daring raids. Under the cover of darkness, you and other small bands of samurai row out in small boats to the Mongol fleet anchored in the bay. You silently climb aboard their ships, wreaking havoc, setting fires, and killing the crews before melting back into the darkness. It is a terrifying form of psychological warfare. The Mongol soldiers, packed onto their ships, can never rest. They are in a constant state of fear, knowing that a silent blade could find them in their sleep. For nearly 2 months, this stalemate continues. The mighty Mongol army, the unstoppable force that conquered a continent, is held at bay by a 2-meter-high stone wall and a few thousand determined defenders. The cost is immense. Men are dying every day. You are exhausted, running on nothing but adrenaline and rice balls. But you are holding. You are bleeding the greatest army on earth dry, one small boatload at a time. The Mongol fleet, meanwhile, is in a precarious position. They are forced to remain at sea, a massive, crowded city of ships packed tightly into the bay. And here, the Khan's grand strategy reveals its fatal flaw, a flaw confirmed by the archaeologists who would one day study the wreckage. The flaw was hubris and terrible project management. In his haste to launch the invasion after conquering the Song, Kublai Khan had demanded the construction of thousands of ships in an impossibly short amount of time. The shipyards of southern China, staffed by newly conquered and likely unenthusiastic subjects, cut corners. The main fleet, the larger of the two, was composed largely of flat-bottomed river barges, never intended for the open ocean. They were unstable, unwieldy, and as the archaeologists discovered from the timbers themselves, shoddily built. The anchors were too small, the keels were weak. It was an armada built by the lowest bidder. And now, this fragile, floating city, full of sick, demoralized soldiers who have been stuck on board for months, is packed cheek by jowl in Hakata Bay, waiting for a breakthrough that never comes. They are a sitting duck, and the weather is about to turn. You first feel it as a change in the air. The oppressive summer humidity that has choked the coast for months suddenly breaks. A wind picks up, cool and strong, from a strange direction. The sky, which has been a hazy blue, begins to darken to a bruised, menacing purple. The sea, once a gentle swell, becomes choppy and aggressive. Seasoned fishermen along the coast exchange worried glances. They know this weather. This is not a summer squall. This is the beginning of a Taifa*, a typhoon. At first, you welcome the wind and the rain. It provides a brief respite from the fighting. The Mongols are forced to cease their landing attempts as the waves become too treacherous for their small boats. For the first time in weeks, a strange quiet descends over the bay, punctuated only by the rising howl of the wind. You and your men huddle behind the stone wall, using it now not as a defense against swords, but as a windbreak. The rain comes down in sheets, so thick you can barely see the ship anchored closest to shore. The wind shrieks, a physical force that threatens to tear the roof from your watchtower. It is the most violent storm you have ever experienced. From the relative safety of the shore, you can only listen to the symphony of destruction happening out in the bay. You hear the splintering of wood, a sound like giant trees being snapped in two. You hear the faint, desperate cries of thousands of men, carried and then swallowed by the gale. You hear the grinding, crunching sound of ships being smashed against each other, their hulls breached, their masts toppling like matchsticks. The shoddy, flat-bottomed riverboats of the Great Southern Fleet are being lifted by the mountainous waves and simply dropped, breaking their backs on the swell. Ships drag their too light anchors, careening into other vessels, creating a catastrophic chain reaction of destruction in the crowded bay. The storm rages for 2 full days. It is a relentless primordial fury that scours the land and annihilates the sea. You do not dare to look out into the bay. You simply endure, praying that your wall, your fortress, your very sanity will hold against the onslaught. You are not thinking of God's or divine intervention. You are simply trying to survive the raw, untamable power of nature. On the morning of the third day, the wind finally dies down. The rain softens to a drizzle. A weak, watery sun breaks through the clouds. You climb to the top of the wall, your body aching, your ears still ringing from the phantom howl of the wind. And you look out at Hakata Bay. The Mongol fleet is gone. In its place is a scene of absolute devastation. The bay is a vast, tangled junkyard of shattered timbers, torn sails, and floating debris. For as far as the eye can see, the water is dotted with the bodies of men and horses. Hundreds of ships have been smashed to pieces against the coast. Others have simply vanished, taken to the bottom of the sea. Of the more than 4,000 ships that made up the Khan's Grand Armada, only a few hundred battered vessels remain. The greatest invasion force in history has been, for all intents and purposes, annihilated. The surviving commanders gather what few ships are still seaworthy and limp back to the mainland, abandoning tens of thousands of their soldiers on the shore. Those soldiers, stranded and leaderless, are hunted down and killed over the next few weeks. The war is over. Japan is safe. As you stand there, surveying the wreckage, the story is already beginning to write itself. It is a miracle. The gods of Japan, roused to anger, have sent a great wind, a divine wind, a kamikaze to protect their sacred lands. It's a powerful, compelling narrative. It erases the nuance, the complexity, the 7 years of terror and toil. It erases the wall. It erases the bloody 2-month stalemate you fought and won. It transforms a victory of human grit, engineering, and desperate courage aided decisively by a timely and catastrophic weather event that exploited a fatal flaw in enemy logistics into a simple fable about the power of prayer. And for centuries, that is the story that will be told. It's a better story. It's cleaner. It serves the purposes of emperors and shoguns who wish to frame Japan as a land uniquely protected by the gods. But you know the truth. You feel it in the permanent ache in your back from hauling stones. You see it in the scars on your hands. You hear it in the ghosts of the battle cries that still echo in your quietest moments. You know that the storm was the final devastating blow. But you also know that you and your fellow samurai had fought the enemy to a complete standstill long before the wind began to blow. You had held the line. You had made them wait. And in doing so, you had left them vulnerable, exposed at sea, a captive audience for the typhoon's final, brutal act. The divine wind may have cleared the board, but you were the one who had already checkmated the king. As our journey through the Mongol invasions of Japan concludes tonight, we're reminded that the past is far from dusty and dull. It's a vibrant, often surprising, and always intriguing tapestry, woven with human ingenuity, resilience, and the occasional ancient mystery that still makes us wonder. This is the Sleeping Archaeologist, encouraging you to remain curious about the incredible tales still waiting to be discovered beneath our feet. Good night.